Hey, Retcon Raider here. Today's video is dedicated to the Raiders, the fine folks who help make these videos possible, with special thanks to Nine Knives, Revenant, Aloise, A Nerd in Warpaint, Antonio Hernandez, Dragon Matrix 7, Excelsior, Gottlieb, Kazorm, Lima, Nathan Welch Jr., Thomas Pietkowski, and Valenrook. Thanks for your support, guys. That said, let's get started. And welcome back to Pathfinder, Wrath of the Righteous, as we settle in for a bit of a more casual episode today. For those of you who keep up with me on social media, for some reason, you may be aware that I recently had a bit of a dental disaster, which I am still recovering from. But I'm through the worst of it at this point, so I thought we'd just ease back into things by finally cracking open that big pile of books we've been accruing. Now, I will say, this is going to be a bit of a side episode. We're not going out adventuring, we're just going to settle in here at the Defender's Heart with our new friends, and peruse a dozen tomes of ancient and forgotten lore. Just bulk up our knowledge of the setting and get an idea of what future events might lie in store for us. And, maybe even unlock a few special abilities. This is really kind of just a test case for me to see how well I can still record after the recent rearrangement of my teeth. Yeah, that's pretty much what it came down to. Anyway, you get the idea. Books today, and then hopefully some more adventuring in the days to come. Angels. Celestials native to any of the three upper planes of creation. Servants of the good gods, angels have come to the Crusaders' aid in their fight against the World Wound more than once. It's worth noting that most of those who interfered in mortal life were driven by their own free will and not by any deity's order. However, the good gods do not forbid such impulses, allowing their celestials to seek a reckoning with the forces of evil. I say we started off with a nice basic tome, one that essentially just defines a common term in the setting. I do find it interesting that they really seem to stress that angels that involve themselves in mortal affairs, like the Crusades, are often operating independent of their deity's wishes. That shows more self-agency than you would expect from celestial beings that embody lawful good. Fanfare of the Faithful. As soon as the supplies for the festivities have been brought into the city and the heralds have spread the news throughout the localities, the celebration began. Thousands of Kenabresians took to the streets to hail their stalwart defenders. Trumpeters and drummers opened the procession, with the orders following behind, the Crusader brethren with their gleaming steel and their banners flying high. The first to come were the ever-bright Crusaders, the most virtuous and righteous of all Kenabres' defenders. So deep was their devotion that, when confronted with the shouted greetings and the glinting of adoring eyes, many of the knights began to pray as though attempting to ward off sinful pride. Leading the contingent and flanked by higher-ranking Crusaders was the Order's commander, the esteemed Siar Kobelin, who is a father to his soldiers and a mentor to his recruits. Next came the Order of the Flaming Lance, those indefatigable persecutors of evil and vice, renowned for their doggedness and fortitude. A heavy shadow veiled the faces of those Crusaders, who too often have witnessed the monstrous nightmares of the World Wound, and who daily risk their very souls in service of the vulnerable and defenseless. Commander Miramir, famed for her scholarship and sagacity, marched with the Order's rank and file. The procession continues with the Crusaders of the Order of the Sunrise Sword. At the sight of their banners, many in the crowd began singing songs and ballads composed long ago by the valiant souls of this order. The spark of inspiration that once breathed life into poetries and odes has grown among the members of this order into a blaze of righteous purpose, which has allowed it to wage war against the abyss with ever greater success. Ashes Strieger led his order, nodding to the welcoming crowds. Also in evidence among the pennants of the orders were those of the Inquisitors, the followers of Prelate Halran, relentless witch hunters who devote their days and nights to punishing traitors and heretics, and anyone else who happens to be nearby. Bringing up the rear of the parade, under the command of Irabeth Tirabade, was the unassuming Eagle Watch, who applied their talents to sniffing out enemy spies in the city. The Eagle Watch was the humblest of all the orders in attendance, surpassed by all the rest, in both size and splendor. Proceeding past the gates, the cavalcade made its way through the city streets to the Guard of Honor waiting to greet the noble heroes, along with Terendelev herself, in propria persona. Which, I guess, is the point where the book just lapses into Latin gibberish for a while? Well, still an interesting read while it lasted. Obviously, this is a primer on the various prominent Crusade orders present in Kenabres. We've already had some pretty blatant interactions with Irabeth and Halrun, of course, who is sadly no longer with us, poor guy. As well as the Order of the Flaming Lance, whose leader, Miamir, who gets name-dropped here, is currently missing in action. We know less about the Everbright Crusaders and the Order of the Sunrise Sword. I imagine we'll have more comprehensive interactions with those orders and their leaders in the future. Hilor and the Spinner of Nightmares. Book the first of the astonishing exploits of Venture Captain Hilor, published by the Pathfinder Society. The Spinner of Nightmares let out a fiendish laugh, and the wind rose up, sending the sound rippling across the roof of the cavernous temple, and off into the darkening sky. You cannot protect them. The demon worshipper performed a graceful pirouette, as though she were mocking the ungainly Venture Captain, who was slowly picking his way across the slippery roof tiles. You may have saved Anthoclitus today, inappropriate, but you won't save everyone who gets in my way. I will always be one step ahead, plunging a dagger into the heart of the next fool, and sullying your path with blood that you will never be able to wipe clean. Hilor lost his footing once again, and only by a miracle did he not go plummeting to his death. His heart threatened to beat right out of his chest, but his mind was consumed with a feverish awareness of how close he was to his target. Only a few dozen paces separated him from the Spinner of Nightmares, close enough to shoot, but the Venture Captain wanted to be sure the bolt wouldn't kill her, merely maim and immobilize her. The hand crossbow that Hilor concealed under the folds of his cloak was throwing off his balance. The jig is up, the Spinner of Nightmares. The Venture Captain leaned forward as though trying to catch his breath, a diversionary tactic designed to weaken the vigilance of the villain, who seemed to be waiting for something on the peak of the roof. You have one chance to save your pathetic life. Surrender now! The Spinner of Nightmares froze, as if considering the captain's words, before lunging forward like a snake and spitting with contempt. You will never see her again! Click, twang, the whistle of the bolt released from its cradle, and the swish of the Spinner of Nightmare's cloak as she dodged the shot, laughing. Hilor let out a bellow, pouring all his hatred and despair into the shout, dashed forward and, slipping on the roof, tumbled to his knees. Gripping a jagged roof tile with his last remaining strength, the Venture Captain swallowed a grunt of pain and raised his head, only to watch his daughter's abductor be swept away on a black wind. I will find you, the Spinner of Nightmares! Hilor's shout seemed to carry far and wide across the whole of Mendev. I'll find you, and I'll tear out your duplicitous heart! That is quite a tale. A very colorful backstory for our local Pathfinder contact. Unlike in Kingmaker, apparently your Pathfinder contact this time around has this whole solo quest arc involving the Spinner of Nightmares and his missing daughter, which I do like. I appreciate that they went through the effort of creating an entire quest line just for an incidental vendor NPC. We'll get to know Hilor a bit more in the future, but for now this is a pretty good Crib Notes version of what his deal is. And eventually, of course, we'll play a direct role in deciding how that dispute is resolved, and whether or not his daughter can be saved. Now here's one that I have had a few requests for. How to make money during the war against demons. Something which Vex would obviously have a vested interest in. My mentor and training partner used to feel sorry for me. I had enough power to summon and hold a lesser imp at best. Would you call that real magic? Ha! But there's nothing a smart lad like me can't use to stake out his reputation and make his fortune. There's one particularly nasty sort of demons, called abracandalus. They're made of the souls of vandals and destroyers of art. In demon form, they continue to do the same. When they see beautiful pictures and statues, they fly into a rage and desecrate them. I once overheard a conversation on the street between two art collectors. They couldn't decide whether they should patronize a young and promising artist or a famous maestro whose best days were behind him. So I made them an offer. How about we place the two paintings side by side, and I'll summon an abracandalu. Whichever painting it attacks first would naturally be the more beautiful. The key was to banish the demon in time, before it destroyed the painting. But that wasn't going to be a problem for me. The collectors agreed to run this experiment, according to my plan, and thus my legacy began. 3 months later, not a single art event could do without me and my demon servant. We were invited to exhibition openings, appraisers' workshops, and auctions. The more enraged the demon became on seeing another carving or slapdash daub, the higher its price soared. And they paid me well for my appraisal. I often staged artist battles in which the demon would choose which of two paintings it despised the most, and the tickets sold like hotcakes. However, there was one unfortunate incident. A gnome and an elf came to me from Absalom, two young bright-eyed artists. They wanted to enter one of these battles, but they offered peculiar sculptures instead of paintings. The gnome had a huge pile of nibbled apples preserved by a spell. The elf had a watering can without any holes, which stood on a cart with one square wheel. This, as they explained to me, was modern art. It was, how did they put it? Unconventive, or some such thing. They claimed it was popular in Absalom, where the gnome and the elf were very famous, unconventive artists. Well, my job was simple: to display their works, gather an audience, and release my demons from its prison. And that's precisely what I did. But the abracandalu came out of its cage, looked at the apples and at the watering can with the cart, and then looked at me like I was a complete idiot, turned around and went back to its cage, with an expression of utter disappointment. It was nearly an international scandal. I was so upset that I even returned the money for the appraisal to the gnome and the elf. But it's all right. My business still thrives even without the Absalom clientele. Meanwhile, where are my more talented fellow apprentices? Half are still crouched over books, learning what they can. The other half went off to those ridiculous crusades and perished. They never considered that demons can be used to make money, and a lot of it. I think I'll soon buy myself a little palace and cover its walls with the works of all the most famous artists. Ha! Oh, I do like that. I think the main purpose of this story is just to introduce the abracandalus, but they did it in a really creative way. That aside, I appreciate the really out-of-the-box thinking that the scam artist used to capitalize on his minor summoning abilities. I mean, overall, you'd be able to summon that with what? Summon Monster 2 or 3? Relatively low level. Though I imagine in a climate like the one we see in modern Kenabres, that would also get you executed pretty quickly. Still, a very bold and apparently effective scheme. On the nature of the divine. Can a mortal become a god? Is the very idea blasphemy? Science relies on experience, where there may be evidence presented in support. But when science encounters theology, it recoils. The term evolution has no application to the divine spark that illuminates dull matter in incomprehensible ways. The foremost example is angels, to whom we owe the existence of our virtuous mortal souls, which brings us to a paradox. A mortal soul transforms into an immortal essence. There are many such breathtaking events, which each promise a connection to the divine. Sunny Sarenrae is perfect proof of this. The Starstone trial desecrated divinity, turning it into a god's exam, where any trickster with a handful of spells who can avoid some traps in a deadly maze may rise to divinity. Is the nature of divinity, then, so sacred indeed? Any trickster, you say, huh? Well, I do like the sound of that. Now, that is an interesting point they're making there, trying to correlate science with the inherently fantastical nature of divine beings in the Pathfinder setting, which obviously exist, and do conform to their own rules, sort of. It's very much a subject that I imagine would fascinate someone like Nenio, or Arilu Vorlesh for that matter. I mean, who knows, maybe that is precisely what drove her to do what she did. Though, again, that's something I imagine we'll explore more as the game moves forward. There are obviously some very blurry lines between mortal and immortal in a high fantasy setting like Pathfinder, and I imagine that a campaign like Wrath is one designed to deliberately explore exactly where those lines are drawn. Sarkorian Faith. Imperial Lord Pelura, Mistress of the Stars and the mysterious light of the Aurora, is one of the most revered deities of old Sarkoris. Her worship was widespread among the Kelids, who built numerous shrines in honor of their patroness. The foremost of those shrines, considered particularly cherished and sacred, was located on a lakeshore surrounded by picturesque waterfalls, called Pelura's Fall. A nice, simple one. Though, once again, name-dropping some pretty significant details here. Obviously, Pelura was one of the patron deities of old Sarkoris, though at this point largely displaced by the more Mendevian deities such as Iomedae and Desna. And then they've also name-dropped Pelura Falls, which I believe is a location we'll eventually be able to visit, though that's well beyond anything I've actually played out to, so that I know nothing about. Side note, it is worth noting that apparently Pelura is still serving as an advisor to Desna, so she does still have some modest influence on current events. Stories Told Us by Spirits. The Night with Harrowed Hands. Kenabres Medium Alliance Publishing. The demon put 2 blades on the table in front of me. On each, a bleeding human heart. "Look," he says. "The right one belongs to a noble and righteous man, a loyal servant of Iomedae. The left one is the heart of a murderer and a scoundrel. But something tells me that they taste exactly the same." I remain silent and don't move. I couldn't if I tried. One of my hands is pinned to the wide armrest with a knife thrust to the hilt, the other similarly pinned helpless on the table. The demon circles and carefully brushes away a strand of hair that's stuck to my forehead. "Your silence saddens me." "Don't waste your time on this performance, monster," I say, though I have scarcely the energy to breathe. "If you wish to torture me, go ahead. If you want to kill me, then kill me. My life is in your hands, but my soul is not, and never will be." The hearts on the plates in front of me continue oozing blood. They've only just been ripped from their owners' bodies. The right one, apparently, belonged to my partner, the left to the criminal we were escorting. But the demon, who'd set his lair in the old mill, killed without discrimination. He walks around the armchair and stops behind my back, placing a clawed hand on my shoulder. "This is not a performance at all. It's a feast, and I will be sated. No, not with this." He can see my eyes still on the hearts. "With you. It's your heart that's in front of me right now. So helpless." The claws on my shoulders tighten a bit. "Goddess, help me endure." After a moment, the demon continues. "You know what you don't understand, you zealous servants of law and good?" He seems to like the sound of his own voice. "It was you who brought us to your land. The more of you who gather here at the edge of the world wound, so brave, burning with righteous wrath, the more like me will come from the abyss. It's not because we want to win a war and conquer your world. Perhaps our lords want this, but trust me, they are as far removed from their subjects as your lords and kings are from you. No, we come for those like you, for the persistent and the proud, who won't break until the end, for those whose suffering is sweet and lasts, for the sweets. He appears in front of me again, licking his lips. I well know that he'll never grant me a quick death. Well, that's grim. But it is also fascinating for two reasons. First of all, that is not the sort of literature you would expect them to publish in a city like Kenabres, especially with folks like Halrin around. You'd figure a guy like him would shut that down in a heartbeat. But it does make you wonder if it's actually intended to be like anti-crusade propaganda, possibly even pushed by demons and cultists to undermine morale and enthusiasm on part of the defenders of the city. And then the second reason it's fascinating is because the demon does make a good point. It really kind of highlights the loop that the demons and the Crusaders have created with the World Wound. When the World Wound was first opened, the demons may have been intent on conquering the region, but at this point they've just sort of created a self-sustaining cycle of misery, because the longer they keep attacking old Sarkoris, the more Crusaders and righteous and pious people come to try to stop them, and ultimately end up suffering and dying in the process, which of course is something that is further exacerbated by folks like Halrin. It really stresses the vicious cycle the Mendevian Crusades have fallen into, despite their original noble intentions. A cycle that the player is ultimately tasked with breaking. Temples of Iomedae, Father Lorian's Guide for Neophytes. Traveler, if the road ever takes you to the outskirts of Kenabres, do not shy away from taking a few more steps and entering the city proper. Apart from the ramparts and the fortifications that stand unshaken, barring the path of humanity's foes, and the noble orders that keep their watch against the forces of evil, Kenabres holds a treasure of a different sort. In days of old, in the fire and the upheaval of the Second Crusade, it became the site for the first and most crucial of the wardstones, sacred obelisks that have the power to avert a demonic scourge, no matter how accursed it may be. No evil creature can pass betwixt two such stones, that now stand along the edge of the World Wound, and shelter the peace of all Golarion. Even vile demonic magics are powerless against them, for the abyss cannot cross the unseen curtain of the wardstones. Should you arrive at the right time and be virtuous and respectful towards those who guard the wardstone, you shall be granted the great honor of sharing in one of the rituals that support the magical strength of that holiest obelisk. This artifact and the spells invested in it are most sacred, for every wardstone was raised by the Herald of Iomedae himself, the closest of her servants, one who is selflessly devout to the Inheritor's cause and the Crusader's great mission. And even if you cannot reach the wardstone, do honor Iomedae's splendor in one of Kenabres' churches, and pay thus your respect to humankind's protector and the sacrifices made by the Crusaders for the good of our world. See, that is more what I would expect from a standard fluff piece in a place like Kenabres. Something which bolsters faith and support for the Crusaders. Though that note about rituals used to bolster and support the wardstone is interesting. I don't think that's been mentioned by anyone else, and we've heard a fair bit about the wardstones at this point. Given how thoroughly some of the various orders and institutions around Kenabres seem to have been infiltrated by cultists, it's entirely possible that that is part of how they perpetuated whatever corruption is inside the wardstone right now. They could have co-opted those rituals quite some time ago. Terendelev, the Guardian of Kenabres. Kenabres has had no shortage of prominent figures, both those who have long passed away and those who still reside within the city walls. But it's safe to say that the greatest guardian there ever was, is, and will be is the silver dragon Terendelev. Oof, well that didn't age well. Among metallic dragons, the silver kind in particular has high moral standards, although, like most of their kin, they often remain indifferent to matters concerning mere mortals. They find it unbearable to watch impassively as injustice and crime are committed with impunity. Gazing down upon Golarion from above, Terendelev has seen her share of injustice and violence, but no tragedy disturbed her peace more than Mendev's war against the World Wound. Drawn into action by her curiosity and her interest in the Crusaders, who paid for others' peace with their own blood, Terendelev swooped down from the mountains and walked among the humans, taking on their form. This world must have felt so odd to her, so different from her own. Luckily for her, Terendelev was not the only dragon living among mortals, and the wise gold dragon, Haliceliax, became a mentor for Terendelev and her sworn brother, Sevalros, who later mysteriously disappeared from history and human memory. During her life amidst mortals, Terendelev performed many heroic deeds. She fought terrifying abyssal spawn, kept Kenabres safe from enemy onslaught, and personally saved Crusaders in need. In one such excursion, she herself fell victim to demonic taint. Onlookers reported that her shining silvery armor darkened, her eyes clouded, and her speech and movements became ruthless and crude. But so great were her spirit and determination that she achieved the impossible. She overcame the seed of evil planted in her very heart, and returned to good once more. Today, Terendelev is a living symbol of the resilience and stalwartness of Kenabres, which serves as a stronghold for crusades and humanity's bastion in the war against the demonic threat. Again, did not age well. But, yes, that is once again more or less what I would expect from your average piece of literature in Kenabres, as opposed to the Knights with the Harrowed Hands piece. Overall, I'd say the primary purpose here is to give us some backstory on Terendelev, who we only very briefly encountered in the opening of the game. And it also serves to name drop two other characters, Haliceliax the Gold Dragon and Sevalros, her sworn brother. And you just know that both of those characters are going to end up appearing again at some point later in the campaign. Given that we know that one of the more elite mythic paths in Wrath is the Path of the Golden Dragon, I imagine that all this stuff would come into play if we were pursuing that path. But, for better or worse, Vex has his sights set on a slightly different path. In retrospect, that note about Terendelev becoming corrupt is interesting too, because that does run somewhat parallel to what is currently happening with the Wardstone. The Keen Edge of Truth, Recollections and Admonitions of an Inquisitor of Asmodeus. The demon lords whose names are known to mortals number no more than a few dozen. Far more numerous are those who aspire to that rank in their own abyssal realm, but who as yet are unable to make a bid for such power. There are hundreds, possibly thousands of such demons, but their names are known only to experienced demonologists, and to those unhappy fools who decide to sell their souls to the abyss, and fail even to find a worthy patron for their trouble. Time and time again, one of these weaker demons will secure a resounding victory, scale the heights, or should that be, sink to the depths, of the demon hierarchy, already fancying themselves a demon lord, when they soon make a misstep and die an inglorious death. The fate of such a demon could serve as a lesson to the rest, but if demons possess the capacity to learn from their own, or others' mistakes, would they even be demons? No. A stubborn refusal to learn is one of the major flaws that distinguish the bedlam of the Abyss from the well-ordered hierarchy of Hell. The demoness Isyagna, she of the Sevenfold Swarm, serves as an example of such a fall from disgrace. One of the many daughters of Lamashtu, she possessed 7 bodies. 7 mortal women of the various races of Golarion, each with an ant's head, controlled by one hive mind. She commanded various insects, swarming, crawling creatures, with ants her especial preference. The author of these words witnessed the oath of obedience sworn by cultists of Isyagna with his own eyes. The witless initiate was forced to meditate while sitting atop an anthill. However, the human sacrifices being carried out by this fool's brethren around the little town I was serving in at the time were far from amusing. It required no small effort to destroy the cultists, who had been summoning ravenous swarms and spreading madness in the name of their mistress. So, what became of her? What fate befell Isyagna? The particulars are unknown, but consensus holds that the mistress of the crawling swarm ran afoul of the master of the flying swarm, the far more powerful demon lord, Descari. Only Lamashtu's intercession saved her daughter from death, but not from abasement and the loss of her powers. Consequently, most of her followers forsook her for the cult of the Mother of Beasts. Today, Isyagna is worshipped by a handful of individuals who possess a stubborn predilection for sitting on anthills. And even to them, she can grant only minor spells. Wow, there is a lot to unpack there. But let's start with what I find to be the most intriguing element, which is the way it kind of highlights the almost transactional nature between a worshipper and a patron deity. Because in the Pathfinder setting, the more worshippers a deity has, or in this case a demon lord, the more powerful that patron becomes. And then in turn they share a fragment of their power with their most devout followers, which of course then just perpetuates the worshipping cycle as it attracts more and more people who want a fragment of that power. It kind of makes you rethink events like the Mendevian Crusades and the self-sustaining cycle of misery it spawned, because as long as those events keep going, the more powerful every patron involved becomes, on both sides of the spectrum. And that's not to say that deities like Iomedae and Desna are deliberately taking advantage of the situation, but they're definitely benefiting from it, at least to a certain degree. It's an interesting thought. Aside from that, they also name-drop Lamashtu, one of the demon lords that is not directly involved in the Crusades. She is, however, an enemy of Descari, and the former paramour of Baphomet, who is one of the other demon lords who is involved. It's hard to say what sort of involvement she might have in the ongoing events of Wrath of the Righteous. She's largely just on the sidelines, as far as I understand. Though the highlighted dispute here between Isyagna and Descari might be something that does come into play. That might end up being like an ally of convenience we can use against Descari at some point. Or just another monster for us to slay. Side note, I did very briefly consider Lamashtu as our patron deity when I was creating Vex Godglove, but the raiders ultimately leaned me in a different direction, towards a slightly different bug-themed goddess. The Varisian Horror. When they reached the cemetery hill, the rain was pouring. In spite of the weather and the priest's weak protests, Rhaegor had no intention of stopping. If his suspicions were correct, the evil that settled in the village many years ago had to be stopped as soon as possible. The local priest, whom Rhaegor and Mogra had approached for help in their quest, was alarmed that these strangers were accusing someone from his flock, and decided to tag along so that he could defend the innocent should the need arise. Ascending the broken stairs leading up to the ancient crypt atop the hill, Rhaegor quietly pulled out his blade and hid it under his soaked cloak. Once the two got to the hewn stone that served as a sacrificial altar, he spotted the gravedigger. Despite the late hour and the violent storm, he was digging a shallow grave. Before Rhaegor had time to intervene, the priest, prompted by a desire to clear the hermit of suspicion, went straight towards the massive, misshapen figure. The gravedigger turned his head, and at first sight of Rhaegor and Mogra, started moving with speed that didn't match his proportions. He leapt far forward, and the shovel cut through the cold autumn air, striking the priest's head. Pieces of skull and bloody scraps splattered forth, and the gravedigger, letting out an unintelligible roar, lunged at the outsiders. Mogra, who had already raised her hands, froze in terror. The gravedigger's gaping maw was filled with dozens of rows of sharp, needle-like teeth, and the sorceress's weakened mind was struck by a murky stream of aberrant blasphemy in an otherworldly tongue. Rhaegor, however, had kept his composure. Dodging to the side, he slashed the corpulent body, as if cutting open a rotten, bloated shell. With a wet smack, the gravedigger's neck and chest burst open, revealing to the mortal eyes the beast's true form, one of a foul worm, whose sickening body was now gushing in coils out of the now useless human frame. The cemetery keeper was an abominable verm-like demon, created from the souls of despicable scum that, in life, used to defile graves and disturb the deceased in the vilest of ways. After rising from the bowels of the abyss and invading Golarion, he and his kind are always drawn to places that used to excite the minds and fantasies of their progenitors. Gross. Well, obviously that rather colorful tale, I like that, was largely just intended to introduce the concept of the verm-like demons, much in the same way the other story about how to make money during a demon invasion was just intended to introduce Abracandaloo. I mean, I will admit, the actual usable information in there is pretty limited. They could have certainly fit it all into a single paragraph, like some of those shorter, more concise tomes we picked up back at the Blackwing. But I appreciate the occasional tale of terror. It's that stuff that's a lot more likely to stick in your head versus the concisely written one-paragraph essays. Without a shadow of a doubt, expecting nothing in return, The Life and Feats of Lord Axilar Trezbot by Nura Denduar. Oh right, that's our eventual Lindsay stand-in. Nerosian Cruciform Cathedral Publishing House. Frowning, Lord Trezbot made a gesture for his people to halt. Everyone froze. No one dared to disobey his order, even one given with his eyes alone. Lord Trezbot loved to say that he could only win when his whip frightened his soldiers more than the demon's claws, and he succeeded like no other in enforcing discipline. The Lord approached what we took for a scarecrow from afar, left in the middle of the wasteland by an unknown farmer. Pricking it with his sword, the Lord made us a sign to approach. It was the body of a young Crusader, a boy not 20 years old, horribly broken, disemboweled with shards of bone sticking out and shreds of skin dangling in the wind. Horror watched us from that stake, eye sockets filled with worms. A contemptuous smirk crossed the Lord's face. "Coward," he said through his teeth. "Fled from the battle. The demons caught him and he surrendered without a fight. And here are his useless fellows." The Lord kicked an inconspicuous bump under his feet, and it rolled, revealing an open helmet's visor with greenish-gray mush inside, swarming with insects. We shivered and looked down, realizing the ground underneath our feet was a mix of shards of metal and pieces of flesh. "Cowards," the Lord said again. "Cowards and weaklings. They were doomed even before they approached the world wound. They should never have left their comfortable homes. What did they achieve? They delivered the demons a hot lunch, that's all. Let's go. While the slugs waste their useless lives, someone has to win this ridiculous war." Without turning away or heeding the disgusting crunching sound underneath his feet, he strode forward. We hurried after him, trying not to step on anything that was, until recently, a part of someone's body. Delightful. He seems like a truly charming individual. Though, from what I recall, he is in fact a noble from Cheliax, which would certainly help explain his demeanor. That is a lawful evil kingdom and the birthplace of the infamous Hell Knights. And as I recall, Nura is not just his biographer, but also his property. So, there's that. Now, it does delve slightly into spoilers, though I'm mostly trying to avoid those. But as we saw back in the beta series, we will actually get to meet Nura, and I believe at this point in the timeline, Lord Trezbot himself is deceased. Or supposedly deceased. Who knows, maybe we'll actually still end up running into him somewhere down the line. While I have played ahead of it, I have not gotten past Act 4 out of 7. So, there is plenty of material I have yet to see. We are moving into the home stretch here, just a few more books to go, but let's hit the pause button real quick so I can grab some water and Maybe a little more ibuprofen. And we will be right back. And we're back. Let's keep this moving. Yaniel. Paladin of Iomedae, the Lightbringer, and Knight of Citadel Dresden, heroine of the Fourth Crusade. Yaniel disobeyed her orders by leaving the garrison to venture deep into the Worldwound alone. 2 years later, she returned at the head of a Crusader squad she'd saved. Died during the fall of Dresden in 4638. That's a very short and bare-bones entry. Unusual in that that is all information that we already got from Sela when we stumbled across Radiance. Though I suppose it is possible to miss that event if you don't solve that puzzle. So it is good that they thought to include redundant information. Not to mention, of course, even if you have heard it, it's good to have that information in writing so you can reference it as needed. That is one aspect of both Kingmaker and Wrath that I really appreciate, not to mention Baldur's Gate 3 to a certain extent. The lore entries are fun to read, but they also almost always end up hooking into some greater aspect of the overarching campaign. Given that Yaniel's been name-dropped at least 4 times at this point, it's fairly obvious that she is going to end up playing some greater role, despite the fact that she is supposedly dead. Oh, here we go. This is the big one. Almanac of the Tower of Estrid Museum. We'll tackle these entries one at a time. Among the Cloudy Colossi. In this picture, the 2 angels, Targona and Lariel, are chasing and fighting a deadly Vrolic-eyed demon in the air, several miles above the Worldwound. After this battle, the skull of the slain demon was long displayed as an artifact in one of Dresden's inner towers. Sadly, this relic did not survive the fall of the city. Interesting. Not a lot to read into that one, I think. Just a name drop for Targona and Lariel. Though, a Vrolic-eyed demon, I believe that is the one type of demon associated with Lamashtu, which does make it somewhat unusual that one would appear in the Worldwound, considering this is largely Baphomet and Discari's show. Given that angels were involved, it must date all the way back to shortly after the original Worldwound opening, the First or Second Crusade. So I guess theoretically that could involve some of the earlier Demon Lords. I don't remember Lamashtu being involved, but it could be a minion of Nocticula, the Demon Lord of Lust in the very first Succubi. She was originally interested in the Worldwound, but she wasn't interested in a protracted military campaign, so she kind of bowed out once the other Demon Lords jumped in and everything just started spiraling from there. Farewell to Sarkoris. Eliandra, the legendary priestess of Pelura, watches the City of Eyes crumble into the freshly opened Worldwound. A caravan of desolate refugees, desperately fleeing to seek salvation in Mendev, can be seen behind her. Another fairly straightforward entry. Primarily serves to name drop Eliandra and Pelura, who we've talked about before, as well as the City of Eyes, which we haven't really addressed. I'd have to double check the details, but I think that was the main capital city of Old Sarkoris, and the place where the original Nexus, the Worldwound, originated. That'll almost certainly be one of our final stops on this grand tour of the Worldwound. Crusader Queen. That is a fantastic album title. A copy of the famous embossed bas-relief originally created by Master Derek Sunhammer. Young Queen Galfrey is portrayed personally leading her crusaders into battle on the 1st of Abadius, 4624, during the First Crusade. Okay. Very basic information about Queen Galfrey, a character we will eventually meet, of course. And also a token name drop for Derek Sunhammer. Though it is odd they would name drop him twice. That's the same artisan who apparently crafted that ring for Elan, Sela's friend, who's sitting right next to us at the table right now. Here we stand, and will not take a step back. Hand of the Inheritor, the Herald of Iomedae, is depicted placing the first wardstone, among the fortifications of Kenabres. Very basic. Reminds us of the link between the Hand of the Inheritor and the creation of the Wardstones. None will escape my all-seeing eye. Inquisitor Hulran fights a shadow demon that he exorcised from a soldier's body. Reminds us that Hulran once existed, and gives us some forewarning of shadow demons, which, thus far, we have been fortunate enough to not encounter. Seat of Grief. A view of the infamous Heaven's Edge estate. This is the place where most of Mendevian aristocratic society at once fell prey to a supernatural plague unleashed by the demons. That's an interesting one. We haven't really gotten into it much yet, but that's the old Arendae estate, which we just recently talked about with Darren Arendae's assistant. We'll find out a whole lot more about that place once we find the time to go out and actually rescue Darren from the impending demon invasion on his party house. We'll get around to it. I'm sure he's fine. A World Long Gone. A thematic collection of various artists' works on everyday life in Sarkoris before the opening of the World Wound. The first triptych is dedicated to the funeral rituals held at the Pelura's Fall Temple for the deceased chieftains. The next cyclus of miniatures depicts various scenes from a woodworker's workshop. This form of craftsmanship held almost sacred status in Sarkoris. Several views of the City of Eyes, the masterpiece of Sarkorian architecture, can be seen in the following series of engravings. Finally, the last painting, The Threshold Prisoners, portrays a group of spellcasters imprisoned in the infamous prison tower. The origin of the picture is unclear, but the woman in shackles that can be seen in the background is widely believed to be the betrayer of humanity, Arilu Vorlesh herself. Oh, that is fascinating. Once again, lots to unpack there. That first entry, of course, reminds us that Old Sarkoris was a largely tribal nation, similar to the barbarians of the realm of the Mammoth Lords. But with permanent settlements, I guess, ones that favored woodworking and elaborate architectural structures. So that's an unusual twist. And then, of course, as the final entry reminds us, because they were more, I don't want to say primitive, but more, let's say, naturalistic, superstitious folk, they had a natural disdain and mistrust for practitioners of arcane magics. Something which, of course, could have ultimately been the catalyst that pushed Arilu Vorlesh to unleash this hellstorm on her home country. Though, of course, that is probably selling her a bit short. I'm sure she has a much more elaborate, overarching narrative. They name-dropped Pelura's Fall, which is apparently where they interred their deceased chieftains. That would certainly seem to imply it's a valuable source of old relics or information dating back to before the World Wound. And even that note about woodworking is interesting because that would certainly seem to imply that a lot of those old relics and artifacts of Old Sarkoris would be of a wooden persuasion. Bows or hafted weapons or wooden trinkets. Items that would be ideal for your more nature-oriented classes. Druids, rangers, hunters. Not something I'm sure that will actually end up impacting the loot takeage that we see throughout this campaign, but certainly something that a game master would want to take into account when designing locations for a setting like this one. Yaniel by the Fountain. This painting is attributed to Denisa Roche, a soldier from the garrison of Kenabres. Denisa was not a professional artist, yet she had one advantage over the professionals who created later portraits of Yaniel the Blue-Eyed. The heroine of the First Crusade sat for this unique picture personally, which undoubtedly gives it much greater historical value. Yaniel is caught during a rare moment of repose near a fountain in the city. The portrait was presumably painted from life over the summer of 4637, 1 year before Yaniel's heroic death during the battle for Dresden. Yeah, yet another reminder of Yaniel and her presumed death in Dresden, which almost certainly means she is not in fact dead, or at least might be undead. There are several means of artificially prolonging life in the Pathfinder setting, as Queen Galfrey can attest to. And the fact that they keep reminding us that Yaniel was present but is dead, it's a bit meta, but it is very telling. And we're into artifacts, starting with the Wand of Zacharias. the wand of the famous mage Zacharias, who made his name during the heroic and tragic siege of the Lost Chapel. As the fortress warden, he sent his apprentices to break the siege in order to save the priests who served the chapel's many gods. Zacharias himself refused to leave the fortress, however, and is believed to have perished in the final onslaught. A popular legend says that the spirit of this brave hero still haunts the ruins of the Lost Chapel, waiting for a worthy crusader to bring back his wand and plead for aid in the darkest of times. This item was donated to the museum by Zacharias' apprentice, Mage Teldon. Teldon. I wish the best for him, but sadly current events do not imply that that is what he'll get. Once again, some interesting stress on a presumed death of a key figure in the early Crusades. Much like Yaniel, I imagine that Zacharias is not quite as dead as they would like you to believe. Especially with that whole bit about him still haunting the Lost Chapel. That is very, very specific. We'll actually be hitting both the Lost Chapel and the ruins of Dresden in Act 2. I figure that's, like 20 episodes out? So it shouldn't be too long before we find out more about the alleged fate of these two heroic figures of the First and Second Crusades. The Vessel of Raellas. This copper vessel and the oil inside it were sanctified by Raellas, priest of Iomedae and faithful Crusader. A batch of lamp oil had been brought to the Crusaders' camp, and Raellas took the vessel to move it to the storehouse. Raellas' faith was so deep that it made the oil shine all by itself, and the vessel became covered with engravings praising the goddess. This item was donated to the museum by Raellas' fellows in arms. Obviously a much tamer story than most of the ones we've seen thus far, but I think very representative of what you would expect from your average fictional religious mythos. The artifact in this case, the relic, would serve very little practical purpose, but would be the perfect sort of item to draw more worshippers. Which, not to cast a nefarious aspersion towards Iomedae, would in turn further strengthen her abilities. I mean, obviously the implication here is that Raellas died out in the crusade because the item was donated to the museum by his fellows in arms. So I guess that fancy pot full of shining oil didn't prove itself particularly useful on the battlefield. Though who knows, maybe we'll find some use for it if we happen to track it down. The Helmet of Scroccia. This helmet belonged to Bathistus Scroccia, Paralictor of the Order of the Gate, and one of the first Hell Knights to serve his duty as a Crusader. During the most unstable and dangerous first weeks of the war, Scroccia saved the crusade from infighting between the worshippers of different gods. When a Hell Knight killed a paladin of Iomedae in a personal duel, Scroccia stopped the imminent bloodshed by stepping up for his soldier and taking the blame for his deed. This was far beyond his duty, but Scroccia defended the honor of his order by proposing to wash out the insult with his own blood. Scroccia agreed to be beheaded in exchange for a peace treaty between the two orders. His death put an end to the rivalry in the Crusader ranks once and for all, and his sacrifice will be remembered by all Crusaders forevermore. This item was donated to the museum by Queen Galfrey, Sword of Iomedae. Oh, interesting. I don't think I've ever actually read that story before. But it is very representative, I think, of the Hell Knights, who do have a notorious reputation, but ultimately, at the end of the day, they are very practical, long-term planners. Obviously, there are a lot of things to be said about their lawful evil methodologies. They're certainly not going to be winning any popularity contests among the less lawful evil cultures. But it cannot be denied that they are very dedicated to whatever cause they set their sights on, and closing the world wound is definitely one of them. I think it's safe to assume that Scroccia is probably very dead, considering that it would have been clearly witnessed by several people, but we will be encountering other Hell Knights throughout our travels, so that does make you wonder if they may end up making similar sacrifices to ultimately help the cause. Assuming, of course, that you can actually put up with them that long. That's certainly going to be an issue for someone like Vex. It's also interesting to note that it was actually Galfrey who ended up donating that relic to the museum, not one of the Hell Knight orders. Which I guess does track. The Hell Knights don't really strike me as being the sorts of people to get bogged down in their own mythologized history. Terendelev's Claw. This is a claw taken from the Silver Dragon and protector of Kenabres. It was cut off by demons when Terendelev heroically saved a group of ambushed Crusaders from certain death. This item was donated to the museum by the Town Hall of Kenabres. I think that's the second time they've actually mentioned Terendelev rescuing a group of Crusaders. And in this case, they also specify that her claw was cut off during that encounter, which is intriguing because we also read that she became corrupted somehow, which could... That could be the source of the corruption, though, I mean, that is a bit of a stretch. I can't help but be struck by some of the parallels between Terendelev's wounding here, her struggle with the demonic corruption that threatened to overwhelm her, and the current situation with the Wardstone, which itself has been damaged and somehow corrupted by the demons. I mean, obviously it's not exactly a unique situation. Staunton went through a very similar scenario, of course. But it is intriguing. And that aside, it also indicates that there is yet another piece of Terendelev out there for us to collect, so we can continue building our own Silver Dragon. That's not weird. Shut up. You're weird. More seriously, I imagine that plays into the whole Gold Dragon path, which is one of the mythic paths you can ultimately end up pursuing. Not something that we'll be doing with Vex, but we'll at least touch on it as we progress through the rest of the campaign. We regret to inform you that the bulk of the Third Crusade exhibits are currently not available for viewing. It has been moved to the museum's storeroom for restoration and cleaning. Please accept our sincere apologies. Oh, well, that is a shame. I would have loved to learn more about those relics of the Third Crusade, or to have even glimpsed them. I can only imagine what wondrous artifacts those champions of the Crusade may have once wielded, and I can but dream of someday wielding them myself. But for now, I'll just have to content myself with this trash I salvaged in a back room somewhere. Guino Pollen. Notes from my travels in northern Avistan. In the knowledge that the best place to observe the effects of extraplanar energy entering our world is the region formerly known as Sarkoris, I immediately set off for that desolate land. Upon arriving in Mendev and making inquiries to find a guide who would agree to escort me to the lands bordering the World Wound, I came up against an unexpected impediment. The local rangers and guides categorically refused to help me. Desna, however, smiled upon me and led me to a local hunter. After 3 tankards of grog, he agreed to go with me to the World Wound and show me the area. By the time he had sobered up, it was already too late to reconsider. We had passed the last cordons and had plunged deep into the forests of Sarkoris. Even thousands of miles away from the planar rift itself, an attentive observer could discern the anomalies brought about by the World Wound. Insignificant differences that become more and more pronounced the closer one gets. The first thing that struck me were the unnatural trees that looked as though they had all been sketched from a single exemplar. Then the quality of the air changed. It tasted different with every inhale, from sulfur to caramel, from acrid salt to spoiled herring. According to the almanacs I had consulted on my journey to Mendev, one of the first signs of the World Wound's creation was towers of black smoke billowing up from the rift. The terrifying sight above the southern steppes and the tales of my guide confirmed that the effusions of ash and poisonous fumes continued to this day, although I did not expect the air there to taste like one was standing between a confectioner's and a crematorium. As we journeyed on, we encountered the remains of dead livestock, dogs, and even people. Some skeletons bore the marks of demon claws, while others had clearly expired of rather more original causes. We even came across 2 perfectly mummified corpses that looked as though they had turned to stone. Skirting around a sparse and foreboding forest, we came upon a plain that was bisected by a series of unnaturally uniform hills. I would have been only too happy to study said phenomenon, but alas, after several paces my guide was hoisted up into the air, and quite literally turned inside out. After shedding my blood-soaked frock coat and the encumbrance of my souvenirs collected along the way, I hastily withdrew. Yeah, I'll bet you did. Guino Pollen. I have no idea if that is a recurring character in the Pathfinder setting, but I like him. That's a very, there's a lot of echoes of Volo there. A character who you can meet over in Baldur's Gate 3. Though, sadly, I somehow missed that encounter, which does bum me out. Much like with Volo's guides, I think aside from the comedy factor, this primarily just serves to give us a general idea of what the interior of the Worldwound is like. Hellish anomalies, which simply grow more pronounced in strength and lethality the closer you get to the center of the Worldwound, which I think is the fallen city of Eyes. Hello, Kaiser. I suppose the one big thing we can take away from this is that if we see a bunch of oddly uniform hills, we should be very careful about floating into the air and turning inside out. But that's just good general life advice, I think. Don't get turned inside out. Yellowed Letter. Half a century ago, our parents fled their homeland of Sarkoris, terrified of the invading demons. They were certain that the war would soon be over, so they didn't go too far and found their refuge here in Kenabres. They used what little savings they had to build a tavern where any Crusader could get a bowl of soup and a good night's rest, in exchange for some money and news about their recent victories. The city looked completely different back then. It was a triumphant city, full of hope, inspiring songs, and brave paladins in shining armor. We praised Our Lady Pelura openly, and hoped that the lands of our ancestors would be ours again in no time. Things have changed since then, though. Our parents have left to the goddess's halls. Dresden is long gone. The Worldwound grows deeper every day, and the Crusaders seem to take more interest in fighting each other and us townsfolk than in eradicating demons. Halrin has gone mad, and now puts all his inquisitive zeal into burning witches. Today, Kenabres is a city of fear and suspicion. We even had to hide our altar of the Shimmering Maiden in the basement, so they wouldn't accuse us of demon worship. Queen Galfrey has recently appointed Halrin the Prelate of Kenabres. Now nothing will stop this murderer from taking complete control of the city into his hands, and serving his so-called justice on everyone. His previous acts of violence were just the beginning of a full-scale massacre. We have to flee, run like our parents did. This time not from demons, but from Crusaders. Soon we will sell our tavern and leave, anywhere away from the agony of this endless war. May Pelura protect the city from whatever comes next. 10th of Lamashan, 4682. Swargel family of the Devamai clan. Well, that is a bit of a downer to end things on, but still fascinating. Based on the details here, that would be just after the Third Crusade? I'd have to double check the timing there, but that does seem to track. That's after the Angels left, and after the cultist infiltrations really started coming to a head. That's around the time when Baphomet entered the fray, and he had a much more subtle approach than Discari. Which would, of course, explain Halrin's rise to power in Kenabres. The Inquisition would be of particular importance at that time to help root out all of those entrenched cultists. No, given current events, it's obvious that he met with fairly limited success. You know, this is actually a really good place to end things on, because it really does stress a couple of the key points we've been dancing around today. It highlights how Mendevian Crusaders did essentially end up supplanting the old Sarkorian culture. They essentially finished what the demons had started doing with the opening of the Worldwound, pushing out the remaining Sarkorians, displacing the worship of Pelura with their own gods. And it also really stresses the perpetual nightmarish cycle that the Crusades then kind of fell into, with both sides contributing to the ongoing misery. It does very much highlight the turning point in the Crusades, the point where hope for the original Sarkorians kind of just faded away and was supplanted by the grim reality of the perpetual forever war. Which, of course, is where we come in, being the random, unlikely adventurer who's supposed to somehow put an end to this vicious cycle. No pressure, right? And with that, we are almost done. That officially covers the vast bulk of the lore items that we have collected over the first 11 episodes of the series. We're over an hour into this, and I've had to do it in 2 chunks, but I really enjoyed that. I love reading all of the intriguing lore, both because it helps inform me about the setting, but it also gives me a better idea of which plot points to kind of hone in on, to focus on for my speculation. Oh wow, and yeah, that gave us a whole boatload of special abilities. The actual practical part of reading all these books. Let's see what we got. Temples of Iomedae, Father Lorian's Guide for Neophytes. Grants a +1 shield bonus to AC against demons. Wow. Though, no, I guess that would not be for shield users, because shield bonuses don't stack. That is a bonus specifically for characters wielding two-handed weapons, or in Vex's cases, who will ultimately be dual-wielding. So that is a fantastically useful bonus for us. Very nice. Though, obviously of limited use until we officially retire that buckler at level 5 or 6. Terendelev, the Guardian of Kenabres. Grants a +1 morale bonus to AC against dragons. A foe that hopefully we will not be facing anytime soon, but yes, I will accept a free +1 bonus to AC, as trivial as that will be against something like a dragon. A very situational bonus, but welcome nonetheless. AC or defensive bonuses are always welcome. The Keen Edge of Truth. Recollections and Admonitions of an Inquisitor of Asmodeus. Grants a +1 competence bonus on savings throws against swarms. Which, yeah, does make sense, given that the book focused on the Demon Lord of Crawling Swarms and the Demon Lord of Flying Swarms. And that is a clever roundabout way of somewhat addressing one of my most harrowing moments from the beta series. The Valley of Infinite Vescivores. Not something I am looking forward to returning to, but this will ease it slightly, I hope. Again, a very situational defensive buff, but welcome nonetheless. And there's the Guino Pollen book. Based on its odd placement in the inventory, you just knew that was going to be an ability book. Which apparently grants a +1 competence bonus on natural attacks. Weird. That is not what I would have expected from what we read. I think that's the first ability book where I don't really see a direct correlation between the content of the lore and the actual bonus it provides. Yeah, I would have expected something more like a +1 competence bonus on nature or perception checks, or maybe world lore, or maybe a +1 on savings throws versus being levitated into the air and spontaneously turned inside out. Weird. Sadly, I don't think we're going to get much use out of that ability. I can't see how it would be useful, but not for someone like Vex. Still, 3 out of the 4 bonuses we accrued are in fact relevant to our build, so I certainly can't complain. At any rate, we are like 80 minutes in at this point. My throat is a little rough, but not too bad because I took that break in the middle. And my teeth feel very weird right now, so I think we're at a good stopping point. There's not much else for us to do anyway, aside from maybe chat with a couple of the folks around the tavern, but we'll hold off on that for now and save it for next time. Not sure exactly when we'll do another lore dump episode like this one. This was, as I stressed at the beginning of the episode, kind of a special case, given recent circumstances. But I definitely enjoyed doing it, and I am looking forward to doing more in the future as time and demand allows. That said, let me know what you guys thought. Feel free to share your own speculation or thought processes on a lot of these intriguing bits of lore, though do try to avoid dropping too many prominent spoilers. I kind of danced around a few myself, At the very least, try to conceal them in your comments so that they're not immediately visible. I don't want to spoil the story for the folks who haven't or have deliberately chosen not to explore it themselves. Anyway, we're going to hit the pause button here. Chronologically, this video does fit between episode 11 and 12, but I'll probably set it on a separate side playlist, just so folks who don't want to watch it don't feel compelled to do so because it's in the main playlist. And we will pick up here next time, as we do continue the official series with episode 12. I imagine we'll just chat with a few more folks around the tavern, queue up a few more quests, and thus armed with our new abilities from these mysterious lore books, we will set forth into Kenabres once more. Balance out all this lore with a bit of gratuitous bloodshed. I mean, wholesome adventuring. See you then. Oh, and remember, although I do love playing Pathfinder, Wrath of the Righteous, you can find out more about the game by visiting the official website, the official social media feeds, or the official store pages. And if you'd like to help support the channel, feel free to hit the buttons that do the things, or maybe even check out the Patreon. Links are in the description.